The worst thing my wife ever said to me wasn't shouted. It was whispered while wiping coffee stains off a diner counter. That sentence stayed inside my head for weeks. Longer than any threat. Longer than any sleepless night. You've never made me feel loved, Callan. Only taken care of. She said it softly, like she was too tired to fight anymore. And somehow that made it worse. I remember the sound of the old refrigerator humming behind her. The smell of bacon grease trapped in the walls of the diner. The flickering neon pie sign in the front window. Small things. Things I never used to notice. Naomi looked exhausted that night. Not angry. Not dramatic. Just done. I stood there holding the monthly bills in one hand and a new set of apartment keys in the other. Not for us. For her younger brother. I'd paid his rent for 6 months because his construction job dried up after winter. That's what I did. I solved problems. Paid debts. Fixed things before they broke. In my head that was love. But Naomi just stared at me with these tired blue eyes and asked, "Do you even know what my favorite meal is?" I opened my mouth. Nothing came out. 'Cause I didn't know. Jesus Christ. I knew the fuel capacity of every truck in my logistics company. I knew which drivers cheated overtime. I knew which warehouse freezers needed replacing before summer. But I didn't know what my wife liked to eat after a hard day. That realization followed me all the way home. I sat in my pickup outside our duplex for almost an hour with the engine running. The neighborhood was quiet except for a barking dog somewhere down the block and the rattling train half a mile away. Naomi had already gone upstairs. The kitchen light was off. For the first time in years, I didn't want to walk inside my own house. Because I knew she wasn't waiting for me anymore. That scared me more than anything. The next night, after work, I drove past the warehouse district and stopped outside a community center near Broad Street. I don't even know why I pulled in. Maybe because there was a sign outside that said night cooking class, beginners welcome. Maybe because I was desperate. Maybe because I finally realized money couldn't fix loneliness. I sat in the truck staring through the foggy windshield while people walked inside carrying grocery bags and casserole dishes. A tired nurse in pink scrubs. An old man with suspenders. A divorced dad trying to calm a screaming little girl. Normal people. I almost drove away 3 different times. Then I heard Naomi's voice in my head again. "You've never made me feel loved." So I walked in. Steel toe boots. Warehouse jacket. Hands rough from years of lifting freight. The woman at the front desk smiled and handed me an apron with little yellow lemons on it. "First class?" she asked. I nodded once. She pointed toward the kitchen. "Tonight we're learning comfort food." Comfort food. I nearly laughed at the irony. Because at 41 years old, I suddenly realized I had no idea how to comfort the woman I loved. I learned 2 things during my first cooking class. First, onions burn faster than you think. Second, embarrassment feels a lot worse when you are wearing an apron covered in tiny yellow lemons. I stood there in that overheated community kitchen while smoke curled out of my skillet, and the woman beside me quietly slid her pan away from mine like I was a public safety issue. The instructor, an older woman named Denise with silver hair and reading glasses hanging from a chain around her neck, walked over and stared into my pan. "Well," she said calmly, "that garlic is officially dead." Couple people laughed. I did not blame them. I had spent most of my adult life around truck depots, shipping docks, and men who measured respect by how long you could work without complaining. Nobody there cared if you could cook. But standing in that kitchen with a wooden spoon in my hand, I suddenly felt every one of my 41 years. Denise handed me another clove of garlic and told me to start over. I almost said no. I almost walked out. Then I thought about Naomi eating alone at the diner again, while I stayed late at the warehouse pretending overtime was more important than going home. So I stayed. The class lasted 2 hours. 2 long, humiliating hours. I cut vegetables too thick. Overcooked the pasta. Forgot salt completely. By the end, my grilled cheese looked like something scraped off the highway. But for the first time in years my head was quiet. No invoices. No drivers calling in sick. No pressure. Just butter sizzling in a pan and Denise reminding me not to flip the sandwich too early. Cooking punishes impatience, she told me while wiping down a counter. So does marriage. That one hit harder than it should have. When class ended, everyone packed leftovers into plastic containers and headed home. I sat alone for a minute staring at the ugly sandwich on my plate. Burned bread. Cold cheese. Crooked edges. It looked terrible. Still, I wrapped it in foil and brought it home anyway. Naomi was asleep on the couch when I walked in around midnight. The television was still on low volume. Some old sitcom rerun flickered across the walls. She had one arm tucked under her cheek and a blanket half sliding onto the floor. I cannot explain why that image hurt me so much. Maybe because I realized how many nights she had fallen asleep alone waiting for me. I quietly set the foil-wrapped sandwich in the fridge and covered her with the blanket. Her eyes opened slightly. "You are home early," she murmured sleepily. "Early." It was midnight. I swallowed hard and nodded once. "Yeah." She looked at me for another second like she wanted to say something else. But then she just closed her eyes again. The next morning, I woke up before sunrise and found the sandwich gone from the fridge. Nothing else. No note. No comment. But later that afternoon, while I was checking inventory at the warehouse, my phone buzzed once. A message from Naomi. 2 words. "Less burnt." I stared at that text for almost a full minute before realizing she was teasing me. Teasing. Not ignoring me. Not distant. Something inside my chest loosened for the first time in weeks. That night I went back to cooking class. By the 4th cooking class, Denise stopped looking nervous when I walked into the kitchen. The first week, she watched me like I might accidentally start a fire just by touching olive oil. Now she just handed me ingredients inside the way exhausted teachers do around slow students. "Today," she announced one Tuesday night, "we are learning chicken pot pie." The room filled with quiet excitement. Mine filled with panic. Naomi made chicken pot pie every winter. Not fancy. Not complicated. Just flaky crust, thick sauce, carrots, peas, and enough black pepper to clear your sinuses. She always served it in chipped ceramic bowls she bought at a flea market 10 years ago. I used to barely notice it sitting on the table while answering emails on my phone. Now I could remember the exact sound her spoon made against the bowl. Funny how regret sharpens memory. I spent most of class trying not to destroy the dough. Denise stood beside me while I wrestled flour like it personally offended me. "You are pressing too hard," she said. "Relax your hands." I stared at the rolling pin. I run a logistics company. Relaxing is not really my skill set. A couple people laughed softly. Denise did not. She just crossed her arms and looked me straight in the eye. "That might be your problem, honey." That sentence stayed with me all night. Because deep down I knew she was right. Every part of my life was pressure. Deadlines. Schedules. Numbers. I treated love the same way. Keep the lights on. Pay the bills. Solve the emergency. Repeat. Somewhere along the line I forgot people needed softness too. Especially Naomi. When I got home after class, the diner parking lot was still half full. Naomi worked late every Thursday because high school football season packed the place after games. I parked across the street and watched through the foggy front windows for a minute. She moved between tables carrying coffee pots and pie slices with that same tired smile she always wore for customers. The strange thing was everyone else seemed to know pieces of her life I had stopped paying attention to. One old man waved her over just to show her pictures of his grandson. A teenage waitress hugged her before leaving. A truck driver at the counter asked if her migraines were getting better. I sat there gripping the steering wheel wondering when strangers started noticing my wife more than I did. By the time I walked inside, the diner smelled like cinnamon and fryer oil. Naomi looked up from the register in surprise. "You forgot something?" she asked. I shook my head. "No. I just came to see you." She blinked like the answer confused her. That hurt more than it should have. I slid into a stool at the counter while she counted receipts. For a few quiet minutes, neither of us spoke. The old jukebox near the bathrooms hummed softly. Rain tapped against the windows. Then Naomi rubbed the back of her neck and winced slightly. A tiny movement. Barely noticeable. Except now I noticed everything. "Your head hurts again?" I asked quietly. She looked up fast. Almost suspicious. "A little." I stood, walked behind the counter, and grabbed the small paper bag from the pharmacy shelf she kept near the coffee machine. "Migraine medicine." I set it beside her without saying anything. Naomi stared at the bag for a long moment before whispering, "You remembered." And God help me, I realized that might have been the first time in years she felt seen. There is a specific kind of loneliness that only shows up after someone stops asking you to change. I realized that 2 weeks after Naomi sent me that text about the sandwich. Before, she used to complain when I missed dinner. Used to call when I stayed too late at the warehouse. Used to wait awake on the couch with that stubborn look on her face like she refused to sleep until I got home safe. Then one day she stopped. No arguments. No disappointment. Just silence. And somehow silence felt worse. I started noticing little things after that. The kind of things normal husbands probably should not need a life crisis to see. Naomi always drank her coffee cold because she reheated everyone else's first. She gave the crispy bacon strips to customers who looked like they had rough mornings. She kept a sewing kit under the diner register because half the neighborhood came to her when buttons fell off uniforms or backpacks ripped open. People walked into that diner carrying pieces of their lives, and somehow she always made room for them. Meanwhile, I had spent years walking past her exhaustion like it was furniture. One Friday night, I got to the diner earlier than usual. Rain hammered against the windows hard enough to blur the streetlights outside. Naomi stood on a chair near the pie display trying to fix the old radio mounted above the coffee station. "Do not fall," I muttered automatically while stepping inside. She looked down in surprise. "You are early again." Again. There was still disbelief in her voice every time she said it. I walked over and steadied the chair with one hand while she adjusted the radio dial. Static crackled through the speakers before soft country music finally filled the diner. Naomi smiled faintly at the sound. A real smile this time. Small. Tired. But real. "There," she whispered. "I missed this station." I stared at her for a second too long. "You like country music?" She laughed once under her breath and climbed down carefully. "Callan, I have listened to this station almost every night for 8 years. 8 years. I felt genuinely ashamed. That same night, after closing, Naomi sat at the counter rubbing her temples while counting cash receipts. I noticed the way her shoulders sagged when she thought nobody was looking. The diner lights buzzed softly overhead. Outside, rainwater rushed through the gutters. "You should hire another waitress," I said quietly. She shook her head immediately. "Cannot afford it during slow season." "I can help." Naomi stopped counting and looked at me carefully. "I do not want your money." The words were not angry. That almost made them harder to hear. I leaned against the counter beside her. "Then what do you want?" She opened her mouth, closed it again. For a second I thought she would avoid the question like usual. But then she looked down at her hands and said softly, "I want to stop feeling alone while sitting next to my husband." That sentence hit me harder than anything else ever had. Because she did not sound dramatic. She sounded tired. Like somebody carrying grocery bags for too many miles. I looked around the diner then. The chipped sugar dispensers. The faded menu board. The old radio humming low country music into the empty room. This was her whole world. And I had spent years acting like providing money for it was enough. Naomi stood to leave for the night, but paused when she noticed flour on my jacket sleeve. "What is that?" she asked. Suspiciously. Instinctively, I brushed it off too fast. "Nothing." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "Callan Whitmore." I had not heard that tone in months. Curious. Alive. "Are you hiding something from me?" And for the first time in our marriage, I almost smiled while lying. The first thing I learned how to make properly was soup. Not steak. Not pasta. Soup. Denise said soup tells you everything about a person because it takes patience to keep something warm without ruining it. I did not fully understand what she meant until the night Naomi came home soaked from the rain with her shoes squeaking across the kitchen floor. It was almost 11. The diner had stayed open late because a bus broke down near the interstate and 40 irritated passengers suddenly needed coffee and pie at the same time. Naomi looked exhausted. Her hair stuck damply to her neck and her sweater sleeves smelled like fryer oil and wet pavement. Usually she would walk in, say she was tired, then disappear upstairs before I could even close my laptop. But that night she stopped in the kitchen doorway. Slowly. Carefully. Because there was soup simmering on the stove. Real soup. Not canned. Not takeout. The kitchen smelled like garlic, rosemary, and roasted chicken. I stood there awkwardly holding a wooden spoon like I was waiting for somebody to grade me. Naomi blinked twice. "What is this?" she asked quietly. "Chicken soup," I answered. Then after a second I admitted, "I burned the first batch." A tiny laugh escaped her before she could stop it. God, I missed that sound. She stepped closer and lifted the spoon for a taste. I watched her face the entire time. Not because I needed praise, because I genuinely wanted to know if she liked it. That was new for me. Naomi swallowed slowly. "It needs more salt," she said finally. I nodded immediately and reached for the seasoning. She stared at me while I fixed it. "You actually care what I think about this?" I looked over at her. Of course I do. But even saying the words, I realized how rarely I had shown it before. Naomi sat at the counter while I reheated the soup carefully. Outside, rain tapped softly against the windows. The old refrigerator hummed in the corner. Everything felt strangely small and quiet. Not dramatic, just real. "Denise taught you this?" she asked after a while. I nearly dropped the spoon. Naomi smirked faintly over the rim of her bowl. "You leave recipe cards in your jacket pockets, Callan." I rubbed my hand across my jaw slowly. "I was trying to surprise you." "You did." Her voice softened after that. She ate 3 full bowls while I leaned against the stove, pretending not to feel ridiculously proud about soup. At some point she started talking about her day. Not the usual quick summary either. Real details. One waitress was behind on rent. The pie supplier raised prices again. A little boy cried in booth 6 because his parents forgot his birthday. Naomi had baked him a brownie with whipped cream just so he would smile before leaving. I listened to every word. Really listened. And somewhere during that conversation, I noticed something painful. My wife had spent years giving pieces of herself away to everyone around her, while surviving on almost nothing emotionally in return. Later that night, after she went upstairs to shower, I cleaned the kitchen alone. Steam fogged the windows above the sink. My hands smelled like onions and black pepper. I found Naomi's empty soup bowl sitting beside the stove with the spoon still inside it, completely scraped clean. And for some reason, seeing that empty bowl hit me harder than any grand romantic moment ever could, because it felt like proof. Proof that maybe love was not supposed to be loud all the time. Maybe sometimes it looked like standing barefoot in a dim kitchen at midnight, learning how much salt the person you love actually needs. People think change happens in dramatic moments. It does not. Most of the time it happens quietly. In grocery store aisles. In parking lots. In the way someone starts remembering your coffee order after years of not asking. A month earlier, I could not have told you what kind of bread Naomi liked. Now I caught myself standing in the bakery section after work arguing internally over sourdough versus potato rolls, like the decision carried national importance. Denise noticed the difference before I did. One night during class, she watched me carefully chop carrots without destroying them and nodded approvingly. "Look at that," she said. "You finally stopped treating vegetables like enemies." I smirked faintly while scraping ingredients into a pot. "I am improving." "No," she corrected gently. "You are paying attention now." That sentence followed me home. Because attention really was the difference. Naomi had not changed. She had always been this person. Warm. Thoughtful. Quietly exhausted. I was the one finally slowing down enough to see her clearly. A few days later, I came home early carrying takeout coffee for both of us. Naomi was sitting at the kitchen table surrounded by receipts, calculator batteries, and supplier invoices from the diner. She looked frustrated enough to cry but too stubborn to actually do it. "You forgot to eat again," I said after noticing the untouched granola bar beside her elbow. Naomi rubbed her forehead tiredly. "The refrigerator in the diner is making that noise again." "What noise?" She stared at me blankly. "The horrible grinding noise it has made for 6 months. 6 months. I felt that familiar shame crawl back into my chest. I had probably sat in that diner 100 times without hearing it, because I was too distracted checking emails or taking calls. I set her coffee down gently. "I will look at it tomorrow." Naomi gave me a suspicious glance over the rim of her reading glasses. "You do not know how to fix industrial refrigerators." "Probably not," I admitted. "But I know people who do." A small smile tugged at the corner of her mouth before disappearing again. "You do not have to solve every problem, Callan." The strange thing was, for the first time in my life I was beginning to understand that. Later that night, I stayed awake after Naomi fell asleep beside me. The bedroom was dark except for the glow of streetlights leaking through the curtains. I listened to her breathing and realized something uncomfortable. I had spent years loving her like a responsibility instead of a person. Protecting, providing, managing, but never really knowing. That realization sat heavy in my chest. The next afternoon I left work early and stopped by the diner before opening hours. Naomi was in the kitchen kneading dough with flour, dusting her sweater sleeves. Country music played softly from the old radio overhead. "What are you doing here?" she asked without looking up. "Checking the refrigerator." She laughed softly. "You are serious about this domestic husband thing lately." Domestic husband? The word should have sounded ridiculous coming from a man like me. Instead, hearing them made something unexpectedly warm settle in my chest. I crouched beside the old refrigerator unit while a repair technician explained the issue. Naomi kept sneaking glances at me while pretending not to. That happened a lot lately, like she was trying to figure out whether this version of me was temporary. Honestly, part of me wondered the same thing. But then she handed me a warm piece of fresh pie crust straight from the oven without saying a word. And when our fingers brushed for half a second, I realized something important. The distance between us had not disappeared yet. But for the first time in years it no longer felt permanent. The first real sign that Naomi no longer expected disappointment from me happened on a Sunday morning at 6:12 a.m. I know the exact time because I was awake before her for once. The apartment was still dark except for pale blue light leaking through the kitchen curtains. I stood barefoot at the stove flipping pancakes while quietly panicking because the first two looked like roofing material. Denise once told me breakfast reveals character faster than dinner, because nobody has energy to fake tenderness before sunrise. At the time I thought that sounded ridiculous. Then Naomi walked into the kitchen wearing one of my old gray sweatshirts with sleep still heavy in her eyes and completely froze at the sight of me cooking. "Are you sick?" she asked immediately. I laughed before I could stop myself. An actual laugh. Low and rusty from disuse. "No," she stared harder. "Did somebody die? That is a little dramatic. Callan, 6 months ago you almost burned water trying to make tea." Fair point. I slid a plate toward her carefully. Pancakes. Scrambled eggs. Bacon that was slightly too crispy because I still had not mastered timing multiple things at once. Naomi sat down slowly like sudden movements might scare the moment away. I watched nervously while she took one bite. Then another. Finally she looked up at me with the strangest expression on her face. "You made all this before sunrise?" "I woke up early. Voluntarily. Do not ruin this for me." That earned me a quiet laugh. God, I was becoming addicted to that sound. Naomi ate while soft country music played from the old radio beside the refrigerator. Outside, the neighborhood slowly woke around us. A dog barked somewhere down the block. A garbage truck rattled past. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary life. But sitting there watching my wife eat breakfast I made with my own hands felt more intimate than any expensive gift I had ever bought her. Halfway through breakfast, Naomi suddenly went quiet. Not upset quiet. Thinking quiet. She traced the rim of her coffee mug with her thumb and stared at the table for a long moment. "What?" I asked carefully. She looked up slowly. "I do not know what to do with this version of you yet." That one landed directly in my chest. "You do not trust it." Naomi gave a small shrug. "I want to. Honest. No cruelty in it. Just honesty." I respected that more than fake reassurance. I leaned back in my chair and rubbed my hand across my jaw slowly. "I spent years assuming love meant protecting you from problems." "I know. Turns out I was also protecting myself from actually showing up." Silence settled between us after that. Warm silence this time. Not the cold kind we used to drown in. Naomi reached for another piece of bacon while studying me carefully over the edge of her coffee cup. "You really go to those cooking classes every week?" I nearly choked on my coffee. "How long have you known?" "Since the soup." "Why did you not say anything?" A faint smile touched her mouth. "Because watching you secretly hide recipe cards in your jacket pockets was the cutest thing I have ever seen in my life." Goo. Nobody had ever called me cute before. Terrifying experience, honestly. Naomi laughed softly at my expression, then stood to carry her plate to the sink. I watched her move around the kitchen, sunlight catching softly in her hair, and realized something that scared me a little. I was happier standing in this cramped apartment making mediocre pancakes than I had ever been sitting inside expensive restaurants pretending work mattered more than home. Naomi rinsed her coffee mug slowly before glancing back at me. Hey, Callan. Yeah. She hesitated just long enough to make my heartbeat stumble. Thank you for trying. Simple words. Quiet words. But after years of slowly losing her without noticing, hearing that felt like someone finally opening a locked door. The first time Naomi cried because of me, I was 24 years old and too emotionally stupid to understand why. The second time happened 6 years later in our kitchen, while I stood there covered in flour holding a ruined apple pie. Funny how life works. The pie looked terrible. One side collapsed inward. The crust was too dark around the edges. Apple filling leaked onto the baking tray and burned into sticky black syrup that smelled vaguely like failure. I had spent 3 straight hours trying to make it because Naomi once mentioned her mother used to bake apple pie every October before bills got too expensive for extras like cinnamon and fresh fruit. I remembered that conversation because now I remembered everything she said. That was the problem with finally paying attention. You realized how much love had been quietly sitting in front of you all along. Naomi walked into the apartment around 7 carrying grocery bags, and immediately stopped short when she saw the kitchen. Flour coated the counters. Recipe cards covered the table. Smoke still lingered faintly in the air because I nearly set the oven mitt on fire 20 minutes earlier. She stared at me standing there in one of Denise's extra aprons with a streak of burned sugar across my wrist. What happened here? She asked carefully. I looked down at the destroyed pie. Several crimes against baking. Naomi laughed once before setting the grocery bags down. Callan, I wanted to surprise you. Her expression softened immediately after that. She stepped closer to the counter and looked at the pie for a long moment. You made this from scratch? I nodded once. The internet lied to me about pie crust being easy. Naomi covered her mouth trying not to laugh harder. God, I love that sound now. Loved it enough to embarrass myself repeatedly just to hear it. I cut 2 uneven slices anyway because dignity was already dead at that point. We sat at the tiny kitchen table eating warm disaster pie while rain tapped softly against the windows. Naomi took 1 bite and immediately reached for her water glass. Too much cinnamon? I guessed. Callan, I think this pie can see sounds. I groaned into my hands while she laughed so hard tears finally filled her eyes. Actual tears. For a second I panicked, thinking I somehow hurt her feelings instead. Hey, I said quickly. I am sorry. I know it is terrible. Naomi shook her head immediately, still laughing through tears. No, that is not why I am crying. Her voice cracked slightly after that. The apartment grew quieter, softer. She looked down at the ruined pie between us and whispered, Nobody has ever tried this hard for me before. That sentence broke something open inside my chest. Because Naomi deserved effort. She deserved attention. She deserved somebody willing to fail repeatedly just to learn what made her smile. And I had spent years assuming financial stability was enough to replace emotional presence. I reached across the table carefully and brushed flour off her sleeve with my thumb. I should have done this sooner. Naomi looked at me for a long moment. Not angry. Not wounded. Just honest. I think you were scared to need people. Nobody had ever said that to me before. The worst part was she was right. My father taught me early that needing anything from anybody made you weak. So I became useful instead. Reliable. Efficient. Closed off. Somewhere along the line, Naomi stopped trying to climb through walls I never realized I built around myself. Outside, thunder rolled softly over the neighborhood. Inside, the pie cooled untouched between us while Naomi quietly slid her hand into mine beneath the kitchen table. Small gesture. Barely noticeable. But after months of slowly learning each other again, it felt bigger than every expensive thing I had ever bought combined. The strange thing about healing a marriage is that nobody applauds when you finally learn how to love someone properly. There is no dramatic music. No audience. Just 2 tired people slowly choosing each other again inside ordinary moments. 3 months after I first walked into that cooking class, winter settled over the neighborhood hard enough to frost the diner windows every morning. Naomi started wearing thick knitted sweaters again, and complaining about the heating bill while pretending she was not cold. I noticed because now I noticed everything. One Thursday night, the diner closed early after the first snowstorm of the season buried half the town under 8 inches of ice and slush. Naomi unlocked the apartment door carrying exhaustion on her shoulders like a physical weight. Her cheeks were pink from the cold. Snowflakes clung to her hair. "You should see the roads," she muttered while kicking off wet boots near the door. Half the town forgot how to drive. Then she stopped talking, because the apartment smelled like fresh bread and tomato sauce. Soft jazz drifted quietly from the radio beside the stove. The kitchen lights glowed warm against the dark winter windows. And sitting in the middle of the table was a homemade lasagna that actually looked edible for once. I leaned awkwardly against the counter holding a dish towel over my shoulder, while trying not to look nervous about baked pasta like an idiot. Naomi stared at the table slowly, then at me. "You made lasagna?" Denise threatened my life if I ruined another pie instead. A tired laugh escaped her immediately. God, I loved making her laugh. Naomi stepped closer to the table carefully, almost like she was afraid the moment would disappear if she moved too fast. "This smells incredible. Do not sound too shocked. Callan, 6 months ago you thought oregano was a type of lettuce. Fair criticism, honestly." She sat down slowly while snow tapped softly against the windows outside. The apartment felt warm in a way it never used to. Not expensive. Not luxurious. Just lived in. Naomi took the first bite carefully while I pretended not to stare. Then her eyes closed for half a second. "Okay," she admitted quietly. "That is actually really good." The amount of pride I felt over layered pasta should probably concern me medically. We ate dinner slowly while talking about nothing important. The diner's coffee machine finally died. Denise accidentally set a dish towel on fire during class. One of my delivery drivers quit to open a bait shop in Delaware. Ordinary conversation. But somewhere between the second helping of lasagna and Naomi stealing garlic bread off my plate, I realized something had changed between us. The tension was gone. Not magically fixed. Just softened. Like two people finally putting down heavy things they carried too long. After dinner, Naomi disappeared upstairs while I cleaned the kitchen. 20 minutes later, I heard drawers opening in the bedroom followed by sudden silence. Then her voice floated downstairs softly. "Callan." Something in her tone made my stomach tighten immediately. I dried my hands and walked upstairs. Naomi stood beside our dresser holding a small stack of stained recipe cards against her chest. My recipe cards. The ugly handwritten ones covered in crossed-out measurements and grease marks from months of failed dinners. She looked up at me slowly with tears already shining in her eyes. "You kept all of these?" I shrugged awkwardly. "I was trying to learn." Naomi looked back down at the cards. One by one, she quietly read the notes scribbled across the bottoms. "Too much salt. Burned again. Naomi likes extra pepper. Try softer bread next time. Do not overcook onions." Then finally she reached the oldest card in the stack. The grilled cheese sandwich from my first class. At the bottom, written shakily beside a grease stain, were 4 simple words. "Try again tomorrow." Naomi pressed the cards against her chest harder after reading that. Then she looked at me with tears slipping silently down her face and whispered, "Nobody has ever loved me this carefully before." And standing there in our small bedroom with snow falling quietly outside the windows, I finally understood something that had taken me 41 years to learn. Some men say "I love you." Others spend months learning exactly how their wife takes her coffee. 2 weeks before Christmas, Naomi finally took a day off. Not because she wanted to, because her body forced her to. I found her asleep at the diner counter around 4 in the afternoon with unpaid invoices spread beneath her cheek, and the coffee pot still running behind her. The place was empty except for soft static from the old radio and snow melting slowly against the front windows. Naomi looked exhausted in a way that scared me. Pale. Fragile. Like somebody trying to survive on determination alone. For years I probably would have told her to rest while secretly expecting her to keep pushing anyway. But people do not collapse all at once. They collapse quietly in inches. I walked behind the counter carefully and touched her shoulder. "Naomi." She startled awake immediately. "I am up." Her voice sounded rough with exhaustion. I crouched beside her chair. "You fell asleep sitting up." She rubbed her eyes and looked embarrassed instead of concerned. The lunch rush was insane. You worked 14 days straight. Bills do not care if I am tired. That sentence made something twist painfully inside my chest because it sounded exactly like me. Same mindset. Same self-destruction wrapped in responsibility. I stood and reached for her coat hanging beside the register. Close early tonight. Naomi blinked up at me. What? Go home. Callan, I still have inventory to finish. I will do it. She stared like I had spoken another language. You do not know how. Then I will learn. Naomi opened her mouth to argue before stopping herself halfway. Slowly, she leaned back in the chair and covered her face with both hands. I am so tired, she whispered finally. Honest. Vulnerable. Human. I sat beside her quietly while snow drifted outside beneath the streetlights. For a minute neither of us spoke. Then Naomi lowered her hands and looked at me carefully. Can I tell you something awful? Always. She swallowed hard before speaking. A few months ago, before all this, her eyes moved around the empty diner slowly. I started looking at apartments. My chest tightened immediately, but I forced myself to stay quiet. Naomi rubbed her thumb against the edge of a receipt absent-mindedly. Nothing fancy, just small places over laundromats or above grocery stores. She laughed weakly at herself. I even saved listings on my phone. Hearing that should have made me angry. Instead, it made me feel sick with guilt. Because she had not wanted luxury. She had wanted peace. Why didn't you leave? I asked softly. Naomi looked down at the counter for a long moment before answering. Because every time I imagined actually walking away. Her voice cracked slightly. I kept hoping you would notice me first. God, that sentence nearly destroyed me. I looked at this exhausted woman who had spent years loving me while quietly disappearing inside our marriage, and for the first time in my life, I understood how dangerous emotional neglect could become. Not dramatic. Not explosive. Just slow loneliness piling up until leaving feels easier than asking for love one more time. I reached for her hand carefully across the counter. I am sorry it took me this long. Naomi squeezed my fingers once. You are here now. Outside, snow covered the streets in soft white silence. Inside the diner, the coffee machine hissed quietly, while the old radio played some forgotten Christmas song from 30 years ago. Small ordinary sounds. But sitting there beside Naomi in that nearly empty diner felt more important than every business deal I had ever closed in my entire life. Because for the first time, I finally understood what Denise had been trying to teach me all along. Love was never about grand gestures. It was about noticing when the person beside you was too tired to keep carrying everything alone. Christmas Eve arrived wrapped in freezing rain and broken traffic lights. The kind of cold that settles into your bones before sunrise and stays there all day. Naomi insisted on opening the diner anyway because according to her, lonely people still deserved hot coffee on holidays. By noon the place filled with truck drivers, exhausted nurses, divorced fathers picking up children late, and old couples splitting pie slices because pensions only stretched so far. I spent the entire day beside her refilling mugs, wiping counters, and burning my fingerprints off handling hot plates. 6 months ago, I would have been at the warehouse yelling into phones while Naomi carried all this alone. Now I could not imagine being anywhere else. Around 4 in the afternoon, the diner finally emptied enough for us to breathe. Snowy slush covered the parking lot outside in gray uneven piles. The old radio near the kitchen played soft Christmas songs interrupted every 15 minutes by weather updates. Naomi leaned against the coffee station rubbing her lower back tiredly, while I stacked dishes beside the sink. Remind me why we did not become rich people who vacation in Florida during December, she muttered. I think because you keep feeding strangers free pie. She pointed a butter knife at me immediately. Everybody deserves pie on Christmas. Yes, ma'am. That earned me a tired smile. I love those smiles most now. The quiet ones. The real ones she gave when nobody else was looking. Around 6, the front bell above the diner door jingled softly. An elderly man stepped inside shaking snow off his coat sleeves. I recognized him immediately. Mr. Delaney. 72 years old. Retired railroad worker. Came in every Thursday for black coffee and meatloaf specials. Naomi's expression changed the second she saw him standing there alone. Softer somehow. Where is your family tonight? she asked gently while pouring him coffee without needing his order. Mr. Delaney gave a small shrug. Daughter got snowed in upstate. Naomi looked heartbroken enough over that information that I nearly laughed. 30 seconds later she was already wrapping 2 slices of pie into containers and stuffing extra dinner rolls into a paper bag behind the counter. Naomi, I whispered. We are supposed to charge people for food. She ignored me completely and handed the old man the bag. Merry Christmas, Frank. His eyes watered slightly before he thanked her quietly and left. I watched the entire interaction from beside the register. The ease of her kindness. The instinctive way she noticed loneliness in people before they ever said a word. What? She asked after catching me staring. I shook my head slowly. I think I finally understand why everybody loves you. Naomi snorted softly while wiping down the counter. I literally threatened a teenager with a spatula this morning. And somehow you still make people feel cared for. She went quiet after that. The kind of quiet where emotions move behind someone's eyes before words catch up. Outside, snow kept falling beneath the yellow streetlights. Inside, the diner glowed warm against the storm. Naomi slowly walked toward me, then stopped close enough that I could smell cinnamon and coffee on her sweater. You know what the strange part is? She asked softly. What? I think I finally feel cared for too. God. That sentence hit harder than anything else she had ever given me. Not because it was dramatic, because it was honest. I reached for her hand automatically while the old Christmas song hummed softly through the diner speakers. Naomi intertwined her fingers with mine without hesitation now. Like loving each other had finally stopped feeling difficult. We stood there quietly for a long moment while snow buried the streets outside and coffee steamed gently behind the counter. And somewhere between the smell of fresh pie and the sound of Naomi laughing at one of my terrible dishwashing techniques 5 minutes later, I realized something simple. Love was never hiding inside grand declarations. It was sitting across from someone after a hard day and learning all the small ways to make their life softer. The last cooking class of the season happened 3 days before New Year's Eve. Denise decorated the community center kitchen with cheap silver streamers and crooked paper snowflakes that kept falling off the cabinets every 20 minutes. Somebody brought homemade brownies. Somebody else burned cider in the crock pot. The entire room smelled like cinnamon butter and smoke from overworked ovens. 6 months ago, I would have rather walked barefoot through broken glass than spend my Tuesday night in a crowded community kitchen discussing pasta sauces with strangers. Now I found myself arriving early just to help set up folding tables. Life gets strange when you finally stop running from softness. You look less terrifying these days, Denise informed me while handing over a box of plastic forks. I am choosing to take that as a compliment. You should. She glanced at me over her reading glasses with that sharp expression she always wore before saying something annoyingly insightful. Your shoulders finally relaxed. I laughed quietly under my breath. That sounds medically unlikely. No, honey. Denise nodded toward the kitchen doorway. That is what happens when a man stops treating love like another job he might fail at. Before I could answer, the front door opened and Naomi stepped inside carrying a foil tray against her chest. Snowflakes melted slowly in her hair from outside. She looked around the room uncertainly before spotting me near the counter. And then she smiled. Not polite. Not tired. Real. Warm enough to soften something deep inside my chest immediately. Denise noticed my expression and smirked. There it is. What? That look. She pointed her wooden spoon at me accusingly. Like somebody handed your heart back after years of carrying it around wrong. I would have argued if Naomi had not walked over right then wearing that oversized cream-colored sweater I secretly loved because she always curled the sleeves over her hands when nervous. I brought peach cobbler, she announced softly. I did not know if people usually bring things. Denise immediately grabbed the tray from her like she had discovered treasure. Sweetheart, anybody carrying warm cobbler during winter is welcome anywhere. Naomi laughed softly while I took her coat for her automatically. Small habit now. Natural. The kind of thing I used to think did not matter. Half an hour later, the room filled with people balancing paper plates and trading recipes while old country music crackled through tiny ceiling speakers. Naomi sat beside me at one of the folding tables, listening to Denise tell embarrassing stories about my first week in class. He held a chef's knife like he was interrogating it, Denise informed everyone proudly. Naomi nearly choked laughing. I knew it. It gets worse, Denise continued happily. The first grilled cheese sandwich he made looked emotionally damaged. Okay, I muttered. That is enough public humiliation for one evening. Naomi laughed so hard she leaned against my shoulder for balance. That simple weight against me nearly distracted me from the conversation entirely. Because 6 months earlier, Naomi barely touched me anymore. Not out of anger. Out of distance. Emotional exhaustion creates physical silence eventually. But now she reached for my hand under tables without thinking. Leaned into me during conversations. Smiled when I walked into rooms again. Human beings really can find their way back to each other if both people decide to keep trying. Later that night, after the class ended and everyone slowly filtered out into the snowy parking lot, Naomi and I stayed behind helping Denise clean the kitchen. I dried dishes while Naomi wiped counters beside me. Ordinary moment. Warm lighting. Soft music. Steam rising from sinks. Then Naomi suddenly looked over at me and asked quietly, "Can I tell you something embarrassing?" Always. She smiled faintly before speaking. A year ago, I stopped imagining us growing old together. My hands paused against the dish towel immediately. Naomi stared down at the counter while slowly folding a damp rag between her fingers. Not because I stopped loving you. Her voice softened. I just thought eventually we would become strangers living in the same house forever. God. Even now those words hurt to hear. But then she looked up at me again with tears shining gently in her eyes and whispered, "Now I catch myself wondering what kind of soup you will make when we are 70. And standing there beside her in that tiny overheated kitchen while snow covered the parking lot outside, I realized love was never about becoming perfect. It was about making somebody believe the future could feel warm again. By spring, the diner started smelling like fresh strawberries again. Naomi always baked strawberry pies when winter finally loosened its grip on the town. She said it made people believe hard seasons eventually ended. I used to think things like that sounded sentimental. Now I caught myself noticing the way sunlight hit the pie display around 4 in the afternoon because it made her smile every single time. Funny what love retrains your eyes to see. One Friday evening, I arrived at the diner carrying grocery bags and found Naomi sitting cross-legged on the counter beside the register fixing the old radio with a screwdriver clenched between her teeth. That cannot possibly meet any safety regulations, I muttered while setting the bags down. She pulled the screwdriver free and grinned. You underestimate my engineering skills. You almost electrocuted yourself with a toaster in 2019. That toaster was aggressive. I laughed quietly while walking over to steady the radio for her. Outside, warm rain tapped softly against the windows. Inside, the diner glowed gold beneath hanging lights while the dinner crowd slowly faded into evening silence. Naomi finally twisted one last wire, and the radio crackled back to life with soft country music. There, she announced proudly. Then she looked down at me still standing beside the counter and smiled in that quiet familiar way that now felt like home. You know something? She asked. What? You look happier lately. The strange part was she was right. Not because my life became easier. Work still exhausted me. Bills still existed. Some nights we still argued over stupid things like who forgot to buy milk or whether I overloaded the dishwasher again. Real life never magically disappears just because people fall back in love. But happiness started showing up in smaller places now. In warm kitchens. In shared coffee cups. In hearing Naomi laugh from another room and realizing I was the reason. I think I spent most of my life trying to earn love, I admitted quietly while helping her climb down from the counter. By working harder. Fixing problems. Paying for things. Naomi leaned lightly against the counter beside me. And now, I looked around the diner slowly. The faded menu boards. The smell of fresh pie. Rain against the windows. Her sweater sleeve brushing my arm. Now I think love is just paying attention before it is too late. Naomi's expression softened immediately after that. A few minutes later, while she balanced receipts beside the register, I walked into the kitchen searching for clean dish towels. And accidentally knocked over an old recipe box, hidden near the back shelf. Hundreds of recipe cards spilled across the floor around my boots. Naomi rushed in immediately. Careful, she laughed. Those are my mother's. I crouched to help gather them while rain hummed softly outside. Most cards were old and stained with butter or vanilla. Tiny handwritten notes filled the corners. Add more cinnamon for winter. Frank likes extra crust. Save this one for birthdays. I smiled quietly while stacking them carefully. Then one card slipped loose from the bottom of the box. My handwriting. Thick uneven letters across a grease-stained card from months earlier. Naomi reached for it first. At the top, written beside a terrible grilled cheese recipe, were 4 words she already knew by heart. Try again tomorrow. But underneath that, in smaller handwriting I did not recognize, was something new. Naomi must have added it recently without telling me. I watched her eyes soften while she read it silently again. What did you write? I asked quietly. Naomi looked up at me then. Rain tapped softly against the diner windows. Country music drifted through the old radio overhead. Ordinary moment. Ordinary life. Yet somehow it felt bigger than every dramatic thing I used to think mattered. Naomi handed me the recipe card carefully. Under my original note, she had written 6 simple words in blue ink. Thank you for trying again today. And standing there in that tiny diner kitchen with flour dust on my hands and the woman I loved smiling softly beside me, I finally understood the truth nobody teaches men like me early enough. Being feared might fill a room, but being understood by the right person, that could fill an entire life.